Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the year 1805, when the oceans belonged not to comfort but to oak, canvas, iron, and relentless discipline. Tonight, instead of imagining heroic naval victories or glorious admirals standing proudly on polished decks, picture something much quieter. Imagine that you are only an ordinary sailor, one insignificant soul among nearly 700 men living inside a massive wooden warship somewhere in the North Atlantic. Before we settle into tonight's voyage, don't forget to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy these slow journeys through history. Now, dim the lights, perhaps open a window for a cool breeze, and let your mind drift across the dark sea. Long before sunrise reaches the horizon, you awaken, not because you are rested, but because someone nearby shifts their weight, causing the entire hammock to sway. The motion spreads through dozens of hammocks hanging only inches apart. Someone coughs violently in the darkness. Another sailor mutters a prayer half asleep. Somewhere farther down the deck, boots strike worn oak planks with slow, deliberate rhythm. The watch has changed again. Your bed is not really a bed at all. It is a hammock woven from coarse canvas, stretched between heavy wooden beams deep inside the gun deck. Above you hangs another sailor, and beneath you hangs another still. Hundreds of bodies are packed into the same enclosed space, suspended like rows of cocoons. There is barely enough room to stretch your arms without brushing someone else's blanket. During daylight, these hammocks disappear. Every morning, they are rolled tightly, stacked neatly into netting along the ship's rail where, strangely enough, they also serve as additional protection against enemy cannon fire. At night, they return, transforming a space built for artillery into one enormous sleeping chamber. You have slept this way for months. At first, the hammock felt impossible. It twisted unexpectedly whenever you tried turning over. Every movement threatened to throw you onto the deck below. Yet after enough weeks, your body learned its strange balance. Many sailors eventually preferred hammocks to mattresses ashore because the swinging motion matched the movement of the sea itself. When waves lifted the vessel, the hammock moved with them instead of against them. That small advantage did not make sleeping comfortable. Far from it. The air below deck rarely moved. Hundreds of men breathed the same stale atmosphere hour after hour. Every lantern consumed precious oxygen while filling the compartment with smoke. Moisture gathered on timber overhead before dripping slowly onto blankets during the night. Nothing ever truly dried. Your clothes remained damp. Your blanket remained damp. Even your skin often felt permanently damp. The salt found its way into every thread of fabric. It stiffened jackets, roughened socks, and left white crystals along collars and cuffs. If rain leaked through the deck above, as it often did, the moisture mixed with sweat, seawater, cooking steam, and the smell of old oak until everything carried the same unmistakable scent. It was not merely unpleasant. It became normal. Modern people often imagine that the worst smell aboard a warship came from the cannons after battle. In reality, most sailors spent weeks without firing a single shot. Instead, the everyday odors came from ordinary life lived in extraordinary confinement. Wet wool, tar, pitch, salted beef, old leather, lantern oil, human breath, unwashed bodies, bilge water collecting deep below the hull. Each scent alone was manageable. Together they formed an atmosphere unlike anywhere on land. At first, newcomers struggled not to wrinkle their noses. Eventually, they stopped noticing altogether. The deck beneath your hammock never remained silent. The sea itself spoke constantly. Wood groaned. Massive beams flexed gently as waves pressed against the hull. Thousands of iron nails shifted almost imperceptibly. Rigging outside hummed whenever the wind freshened. Sometimes a loose block knocked rhythmically against a mast through the entire night. Zap. Pause. Zap. Pause. Hour after hour. The ship sounded alive. Experienced sailors even claimed they could tell changing weather simply by listening to these noises while lying in darkness. A different creak might mean stronger wind. Another groan suggested heavier seas. Silence, oddly enough, often felt more unsettling than noise. Rats contributed their own nighttime orchestra. They scurried along beams searching for crumbs dropped after supper. Occasionally, one darted across someone's blanket, provoking sleepy curses from nearby hammocks. Cats sometimes lived aboard specifically to hunt them, although even the most determined feline never truly won that battle. Where grain existed, rats followed. Where ships crossed oceans, grain always existed. Your greatest enemy during sleep, however, was neither rat nor smells. It was interruption. Life aboard a Royal Navy warship never completely stopped. One portion of the crew remained awake at all hours. The watch system divided the day into rotating shifts, ensuring someone always handled sails, maintained course, observed weather, and watched for enemy ships. If your watch began at midnight, you climbed reluctantly from your warm hammock into freezing darkness while others settled down to sleep. Time itself felt strangely distorted. Instead of mornings and evenings, sailors thought in watches. Middle watch, morning watch, forenoon watch, afternoon watch, first dog watch, second dog watch, night watch. Your body eventually forgot ordinary schedules. Sometimes you slept shortly after sunset. Sometimes just before dawn. Sometimes during daylight. Sometimes hardly at all. Storms ignored every schedule. When rough weather arrived, sleep became a luxury few enjoyed. The order echoed through the vessel before many sailors fully understood what had happened. All hands. Within moments, hundreds of men scrambled from hammocks, pulling on jackets while the ship pitched violently beneath their bare feet. The carefully arranged sleeping space vanished almost instantly as every hammock disappeared into storage. Now the gun deck belonged once more to work rather than rest. Above, rain-lashed canvas sails. Wind screamed through rigging. Cold seawater burst across the deck with astonishing force. Below, the hull shuddered under every crashing wave. Returning to sleep during such nights was impossible. Sometimes storms continued for 2 or 3 days. Sometimes even longer. Exhaustion became another member of the crew. If fortune favored you, calmer weather eventually returned. The sea settled into slower swells. Lanterns stopped swinging so wildly. Voices softened once more. One by one, the hammocks reappeared. You climbed inside gratefully despite every discomfort. There was another reason hammocks remained so close together. Warmth. During winter voyages across the Atlantic, hundreds of sleeping bodies generated precious heat. Individual comfort hardly mattered compared with survival. A sailor sleeping alone in an empty compartment might freeze far more easily than one surrounded by companions only inches away. Privacy simply did not exist. Changing clothes happened in front of everyone. Sleeping happened beside everyone. Illness spread quickly because everyone lived together continuously. Friendships formed just as quickly. Men learned one another's habits without trying. One snored loudly. Another talked while dreaming. Someone always woke before everyone else. Someone always complained about the food. Someone always sang softly before sleeping, perhaps remembering home hundreds or thousands of miles away. Letters from family became treasured possessions. Many sailors carried folded notes tucked inside jackets or sea chests, reading them repeatedly whenever time allowed. In darkness before sleep, memories often replaced conversation. Faces gradually faded after years at sea, yet familiar voices lingered surprisingly clear inside the mind. You might remember your mother's kitchen, a narrow village street, church bells on Sunday morning, the smell of fresh bread, grass after rain. Simple things became luxuries impossible to replace aboard a floating fortress built almost entirely from oak. Even dreams changed. Instead of imagining glorious adventures, many sailors dreamed of stillness. A room that did not move. Silence without creaking timber. A bed that remained perfectly level. Dry sheets. Fresh air entering through an open window. For them, those ordinary comforts became almost unbelievable fantasies. Yet despite everything, the wooden warship slowly became home. Not because anyone wished it to be. Because humans possess an extraordinary ability to adapt. Weeks became months. Months became years. The same beams overhead witnessed laughter, arguments, prayers, celebrations, punishments, and quiet conversations whispered after lanterns dimmed. Every scratch carved into the timber told part of someone else's story. One rainy evening, as the ship sailed westward beneath low gray clouds, you settled into your hammock earlier than usual. The day's work had been unusually exhausting, involving endless pumping of seawater after discovering a small but persistent leak near the lower hull. Every sailor's shoulders ached. The lantern nearest your hammock flickered gently. Somewhere nearby, an older seaman began telling a story about serving aboard another ship nearly 20 years earlier during the French Revolutionary Wars. His voice remained calm, almost hypnotic, blending naturally with the endless murmur of waves striking oak. You listened without speaking. Outside, the wind slowly strengthened. The hull answered with familiar groans. Above your head, rigging tightened. No one yet realized that before On the sea would transform completely. and the peaceful rhythm of another ordinary night aboard His Majesty's wooden warship was about to give way to a storm that every surviving sailor would remember for the rest of his life. The older sailor paused just long enough to wet his lips with a sip of lukewarm water before continuing his tale. His voice never rose above the steady groan of the timber around him, forcing everyone nearby to listen carefully. Stories aboard a warship were never shouted unless they concerned immediate danger. They were spoken quietly, almost respectfully, as though the vessel itself deserved not to be disturbed. "I served aboard the HMS Orion before this one," he murmured. "She rode lower in the water than this ship, and every winter crossing she leaked like an old barrel. We pumped so long one voyage that I dreamed about the handles moving even after I finally lay down." A few tired chuckles drifted through the darkness before fading again. You smiled without opening your eyes. It was difficult to tell whether the gentle swaying came from the sea or from the breathing of hundreds of men suspended in their hammocks. Both seemed to blend into a single rhythm. The lantern hanging several yards away dimmed briefly as a draft found its way through the hatch above. Shadows stretched across the beams before shrinking again. Outside, the wind continued strengthening. No alarm had yet sounded. Experienced sailors often sensed changes long before officers gave orders. The ship itself provided countless warnings to anyone who had spent enough years listening. The vibration beneath your hammock became slightly sharper. The creaking overhead lost its slow, lazy rhythm and became quicker, almost impatient. Someone farther down the deck whispered, "Fresh breeze." Another answered, "Aye, stronger than before." Then silence returned. The North Atlantic possessed an unsettling habit of changing its mood with very little warning. A calm evening could become a violent night before midnight. Sailors respected that uncertainty more than they feared enemy fleets. An opposing warship might never appear. Bad weather always would. You tried closing your eyes again. Sleep came only in fragments aboard a wooden warship. Rarely did anyone enjoy uninterrupted rest. Even during peaceful voyages, tiny disturbances constantly reminded every sailor that they floated upon thousands of tons of moving water. A loose bucket rolled somewhere along the deck before striking a beam with a dull thud. Someone coughed again. Another man turned over in his hammock, making nearby canvas beds sway gently. Drops of condensation formed overhead before falling onto blankets with soft, irregular taps. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. Then came the first unmistakable sound. Not shouting. Not thunder. Canvas. The sails snapped sharply somewhere high above the masts. Every experienced sailor aboard recognized that noise. Wind had shifted. Only seconds later, boots pounded across the upper deck. The footsteps multiplied rapidly. Orders followed. Though muffled by thick planking, the urgency in the officers' voices carried easily through the hull. You opened your eyes. Nearly everyone around you had done the same. Nobody spoke. There existed an unspoken understanding among seasoned crews. If officers hurried at night, everyone else prepared mentally to do the same. Another loud crack echoed overhead. This time the entire hull leaned noticeably. Your hammock swung farther than before. One sailor instinctively grabbed the edge of his canvas to steady himself. The older storyteller sighed quietly. "Here we go." His words had scarcely left his mouth when the shrill whistle of the boatswain pierced the darkness. All hands. The peaceful atmosphere vanished instantly. Blankets flew aside. Men dropped from hammocks almost simultaneously, landing barefoot on cold oak planks polished smooth by decades of use. Sleep disappeared as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Within moments, the gun deck transformed into organized movement. Every sailor knew precisely where he belonged. There was remarkably little confusion. Years of relentless drills ensured that each man reacted almost automatically. Hands reached upward to untie hammocks. Canvas beds disappeared into tight rolls with astonishing speed. Others hurried toward storage netting while still fastening jackets over coarse linen shirts. No one complained. No one questioned the order. Outside, another gust struck the ship with tremendous force. The vessel heeled farther to starboard. Several men instinctively spread their feet wider to keep balance. The familiar level floor beneath them had become an angled surface. Lanterns swung violently from overhead hooks, throwing enormous shadows across rows of silent cannons. The guns themselves remained secured by thick ropes, but even they groaned slightly against their restraints as the L rolled. You climbed the ladder toward the upper deck, gripping damp wooden rails polished smooth by countless hands before yours. The moment your head emerged above deck, cold air struck your face like icy water. Rain had begun. Not heavy rain, just enough to soak clothing within minutes. Clouds covered every star. The moon had vanished completely. Only lanterns near the quarterdeck provided patches of yellow light amid overwhelming darkness. Wind tore across the open sea with increasing strength. The great sails thundered overhead, each gust filling them until the canvas sounded almost alive. Rigging hummed deep within the masts, creating strange notes that rose and fell with every blast. The captain stood near the wheel, cloak whipping wildly around him. His voice remained calm despite the worsening conditions. Reduce sail. Order spread immediately. Lieutenants repeated them. Bosun's mates echoed them again. Men hurried upward into the rigging. Watching them always inspired a peculiar mixture of admiration and disbelief. They climbed not by ladders but by rope. Bare feet and practiced hands carried them effortlessly into darkness more than 100 feet above the deck. From below, they appeared little more than moving shadows against black clouds. You had climbed those shrouds many times yourself. Even after years at sea, the height still demanded respect. Each foot searched carefully for the next rope. Each hand gripped tightly despite rain, making every strand slippery. Below waited not soft earth, but solid timber and iron fittings. One mistake could end a sailor's life before anyone reached him. Tonight, every movement became even more dangerous. The mast swayed continuously. Wind tried pulling each man backward into empty space. Rain stung exposed faces. Yet reefing the sails had to be done. Leaving too much canvas exposed risked something far worse. A snapped mast. Among the gravest disasters aboard a sailing warship was losing a mast during rough weather. Those towering wooden spars carried enormous weight. If one broke, it could smash boats, crush sailors, destroy rigging, and render the ship nearly helpless until repairs became possible. Every man climbing tonight understood exactly why speed mattered. From your position near the mainmast, you watched dark figures working high above. Small lanterns occasionally illuminated a sailor balancing upon a narrow yard no wider than a man's foot. He leaned forward against roaring wind, fingers working frozen ropes with astonishing precision. There was no applause, no dramatic speeches, only work, relentless necessary work. Meanwhile, the sea continued changing beneath the hull. Earlier that evening, the waves had rolled gently. Now they rose higher with each passing minute. The bow climbed steadily upward before dropping again into valleys of black water invisible, except when white foam briefly reflected lantern light. The spray burst over the forecastle. Within moments, every sailor on deck stood soaked. The salt water found its way beneath collars and sleeves. Cold fingers quickly became numb. You wiped rain from your eyes only for another gust to replace it immediately. Somewhere forward, a sailor lost his footing. For one terrifying heartbeat, his body slid across the slanting deck. Fortunately, another crewman caught his arm before momentum carried him against the rail. Neither spoke. There was no time. Both simply resumed working. Such moments occurred more often than many imagined. Life aboard a wooden warship rarely involved dramatic battles. Instead, survival depended upon countless ordinary acts of competence repeated every day. A properly tied knot, a securely fastened cannon, a lantern extinguished before falling, a sailor noticing frayed rope before it snapped. Tiny decisions accumulated into survival. The storm strengthened further. Now rain came sideways. Visibility shrank dramatically. The horizon disappeared altogether. Sea and sky merged into one endless darkness, interrupted only by crashing white water. The helmsman gripped the great wheel with both hands. Holding course demanded constant effort. Every wave attempted twisting the rudder from their control. Nearby, the sailing master watched compass and sea with unwavering concentration. He issued small corrections rather than dramatic commands. A degree to port. Steady. Ease her. Hold. Again. His calmness spread through everyone nearby. Panic served no purpose aboard ship. Discipline accomplished everything. Hours passed this way. Nobody counted them accurately. Time dissolved into effort. Pull. Tie. Climb. Hold. Brace. Wait. Repeat. Eventually, the initial violence settled into something different. Not calm. Endurance. The crew had reduced enough sail for the ship to ride more safely through the growing weather. She still pitched heavily, but no longer fought the wind with reckless force. On oath. Why now did exhaustion begin making itself known? Arms trembled. Shoulders burned. Wet clothing clung heavily to every movement. Several sailors leaned briefly against the bulwarks, drawing deep breaths before returning to duty. Below deck, conditions had become equally unpleasant. Water seeped through seams despite constant maintenance. Small streams trickled across worn planks toward the bilge. Pump crews had already begun their endless labor once more, raising seawater bucket after bucket before throwing it overboard. It was work that rarely received recognition. No medals honored successful pumping, yet every ship afloat depended upon it. Even the strongest oak hull admitted water. Every vessel leaked. The only difference lay in how much. One young sailor working the pump had joined the Navy barely 6 months earlier. His hands, once soft from farm work, now bore thick calluses split open by rope and salt. He pushed the long wooden handle with weary determination, saying nothing as older sailors beside him maintained the steady rhythm. Up, down, up, down. The sound blended with the storm outside until it became another heartbeat within the living body of the ship. Somewhere overhead, thunder finally rolled across the ocean, low and distant, almost as though the sky itself had decided to join the chorus of creaking oak, straining rope, crashing waves, and hundreds of determined men who understood that before they could think about sleep again, they first had to ensure the ship survived the night. The first flash of lightning arrived without warning. For an instant, the entire ocean transformed into daylight. Every mast, every rope, every sail, and every exhausted sailor stood frozen inside a brilliant white glow before darkness swallowed everything once again. The light lasted only the briefest moment, yet it revealed enough to remind everyone how completely surrounded they were by water. Waves stretched toward every horizon. No coastline. No friendly harbor. No fishing boats. Nothing but an endless wilderness of restless sea. A heartbeat later, thunder rolled across the Atlantic with such depth that it seemed to rise from beneath the ship instead of above it. The sound traveled through the timbers, vibrating beneath your boots before fading into the distance. No one reacted dramatically. Veteran sailors rarely did. Lightning was frightening but routine. Storms had frightened them before, and storms would continue frightening them long after tonight. Their attention remained fixed upon ropes, sails, pumps, and the countless small duties that prevented disaster. The youngest members of the crew, however, could not hide their expressions quite so easily. One powder monkey, barely 14 years old, stood beside the hatch clutching a coil of rope nearly as large as his own chest. Rain streamed down his face, making it impossible to tell whether his eyes watered from fear or from the weather itself. He had been at sea less than 4 months. Back home, somewhere near Portsmouth, his family probably imagined him sailing proudly with His Majesty's Navy, standing beneath glorious flags while brass bands welcomed victorious fleets into harbor. The reality looked rather different. His jacket hung heavy with rainwater. His fingers shook from cold. His stomach had emptied itself over the side twice since midnight. No glorious music accompanied this voyage. Only wind. Only waves. Only work. An older sailor noticed the boy struggling to untangle the rope. Without saying a word, he stepped beside him, loosened one stubborn knot with practiced fingers, handed the coil back, and returned to his own station. That tiny act lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Yet aboard a warship, those silent moments mattered enormously. Life depended upon experience passing quietly from one generation to the next. There was little time for lengthy instruction once storms arrived. Young sailors learned by watching, by copying, by surviving. The Navy itself understood this better than anyone. Most boys who first came aboard knew almost nothing about the sea. They might recognize a fishing boat or understand the tides near their village, but a 74-gun ship of the line was an entirely different world. Everything possessed its own name. Not ropes but lines. Not walls but bulkheads. Not kitchen but galley. Not bathroom but heads. Not floor but deck. The language itself reshaped the mind. Even directions changed. No one said left or right. Everything became port and starboard. Forward became the bow. Backward became the stern. Above became aloft. Below became below decks. Within months, the old vocabulary began disappearing almost without notice. A sailor stepping ashore after years at sea sometimes caught himself using naval terms even while speaking to family members who had never seen an ocean. Another violent gust swept across the deck. The foremast shuddered. Rigging groaned loudly enough to drown out several shouted orders. You instinctively looked upward. Every experienced sailor did the same whenever unusual sounds echoed through the masts. Wood communicated constantly. Healthy timber produced familiar noises. Unfamiliar sounds demanded immediate attention. High above, one of the topmen pointed toward a line whipping wildly against the yard. It had not broken. Not yet. But its fibers had begun separating. The damage was obvious even from below whenever lightning illuminated the mast. A lieutenant made his decision instantly. Replace it. Several sailors exchanged quick glances. No one envied the man selected for that task. Climbing into the rigging during daylight required confidence. Climbing during rain demanded courage. Climbing at night during a storm required something beyond both. The chosen sailor nodded only once. He secured a fresh line around his shoulder before beginning the ascent. No speeches. No hesitation. Simply another duty. Watching him disappear into darkness reminded you how often heroism aboard wooden warships looked remarkably ordinary. History books celebrated admirals. Paintings glorified victories. Yet ships survived because anonymous sailors climbed wet ropes in dangerous weather without expecting anyone to remember their names. His silhouette vanished among the shrouds. Several minutes passed. Those waiting below could do nothing except continue their own work. Finally, the damaged line stopped whipping. Moments later, a new one tightened cleanly into place. The mast steadied. A quiet sense of relief spread through nearby sailors, though nobody paused long enough to celebrate. Another task always waited. Near the waist of the ship, several Marines stood beneath dripping cloaks with muskets carefully protected from moisture. Their presence surprised many people who imagined soldiers only fought during battles. In reality, Marines performed countless duties aboard naval vessels. They guarded prisoners, enforced discipline, protected officers when necessary, assisted during emergencies. During storms, they often became extra hands wherever strength was required. Tonight they hauled alongside ordinary seamen with no distinction between them. Nature ignored rank. Rain soaked everyone equally. As the hours continued, hunger slowly returned. The evening meal had long since disappeared from tired stomachs. Unfortunately, storms rarely respected meal times. The ship's cook had extinguished most of the galley fires hours earlier, cooking over open flames while the vessel pitched violently invited disaster. Hot iron pots could become deadly weapons if thrown across the galley by sudden rolls. Instead, a few sailors carried around buckets containing hard ship's biscuit. Each man accepted one almost automatically. You took yours without enthusiasm. The biscuit felt nearly as solid as the oak surrounding you. Months after leaving port, these biscuits had become legendary for their hardness. Many sailors jokingly claimed they could survive enemy cannon fire. The joke existed because it contained a measure of truth. Fresh bread disappeared within days of departure. After that came ship's biscuit. Simple, dry, exceptionally durable. Unfortunately, durability came at a cost. Before eating, most sailors examined each biscuit carefully beneath lantern light. Tiny dark specks sometimes moved. Weevils. Small beetles frequently infested stored flour despite every effort to prevent them. New sailors often reacted with disgust. Veterans merely shrugged. Some tapped the biscuit against a beam, knocking insects free. Others ignored them altogether. Food at sea encouraged practicality over delicacy. Hunger rarely permitted excessive standards. You soften the biscuit inside a mug of watered beer before attempting to bite it. Even then, chewing required patience. Nearby, another sailor laughed quietly. Better than last voyage. Someone asked why. They gave us biscuit so old we thought. King George himself had baked it. A ripple of weary amusement passed among the men. Humor aboard ship possessed a curious quality. It rarely erupted into loud laughter. Instead, it appeared in brief remarks, dry observations, and understated complaints shared during difficult moments. Those tiny exchanges relieved pressure that might otherwise overwhelm exhausted minds. Rain gradually lessened. Wind, however, showed little intention of calming. The sea continued lifting the great ship like a child's toy before dropping her heavily into the trough between waves. Every impact echoed throughout the hull. The cannons strained against their breaching ropes. Barrels shifted slightly inside storage racks. Glass lanterns rattled continuously. Deep below, the carpenter completed another inspection. His responsibility extended far beyond repairing broken furniture. The ship's carpenter ranked among the most important men aboard. During battle, he assessed structural damage. During storms, he searched constantly for leaks, cracked beams, weakened masts, and anything else threatening the vessel itself. His report tonight brought cautious encouragement. "The hull's holding." Those simple words carried enormous weight. Ships rarely sank because sailors grew tired. They sank because their structure finally surrendered. Tonight, despite the punishment, the old oak remained strong. Many of the massive timbers supporting this vessel had begun life as English oak trees more than a century earlier. Some had stood quietly through the reign of Queen Anne before shipbuilders ever marked them for felling. Nature had spent generations growing the wood. Shipwrights had spent years shaping it. Now those ancient trees carried hundreds of lives across one of Earth's most unpredictable oceans. Few sailors considered such things during ordinary days. Storms inspired reflection. Another flash of lightning illuminated the sea ahead. This time something unusual appeared. Only for an instant. A pale shape. Then darkness. You blinked. Had it been merely the crest of a wave? Another sailor near the bow narrowed his eyes. I saw it too. The lookout leaned farther over the forecastle, peering into darkness despite sheets of rain still drifting across the water. Minutes passed. Nothing. Perhaps imagination had exaggerated ordinary foam. Perhaps not. Then lightning returned. Brighter than before. Long enough to reveal a jagged mass rising directly from the Black Sea before vanishing once again. Not another ship. Not drifting wreckage. Rock. The lookout's voice cut through the storm with startling urgency. Land ahead. Every conversation stopped instantly. Every head turned toward the bow. Charts insisted there should be nothing dangerous nearby. Yet the ocean cared nothing for charts. Hidden reefs, isolated rocks, and poorly surveyed coastlines had ended countless voyages throughout history. The captain moved without panic, but with unmistakable speed. He raised his telescope instinctively before remembering that complete darkness rendered it nearly useless. Instead, he trusted the most valuable instrument aboard any sailing ship: the eyes of experienced sailors. Orders rang across the deck. The helmsmen tightened their grip. Topmen prepared to adjust what little sail remained. Every man understood that avoiding an unseen obstacle during a nighttime storm demanded precision bordering on perfection. The next few minutes would decide whether everyone aboard returned to their hammocks before dawn, or whether those hammocks, along with the entire ship, would soon lie shattered beneath the freezing waters of the Atlantic. The captain did not raise his voice. He never needed to. Years at sea had taught him that calm commands carried farther than panic ever could. Even with the wind tearing across the quarterdeck, the officers repeated every order until it reached the men working forward. Starboard your helm, steady now, don't overcorrect. The two helmsmen leaned against the great wooden wheel with all the strength left in their exhausted bodies. Water streamed down the spokes as they fought the pressure transmitted through the rudder. Every swell tried to wrench the wheel from their hands. The ship answered reluctantly. She was enormous. More than 1,700 tons of oak, iron, canvas, gunpowder, food, water, livestock, ammunition, and nearly 700 human beings did not change direction quickly. A wooden ship of the line possessed tremendous momentum. Even if danger appeared only a few hundred yards ahead, she could not simply turn aside like a fishing boat. She needed room. She needed time. Both were becoming increasingly scarce. Another flash of lightning tore across the clouds. This time everyone on the forecastle saw it clearly. Dark rocks. Jagged. Uneven. White water exploded against them before vanishing back into the Black Sea. The lookout high. Dee not imagined anything. Several sailors instinctively crossed themselves. Others whispered brief prayers beneath their breath. No officer rebuked them. Faith had accompanied sailors for centuries. Whether Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, or simply superstitious, almost every man aboard carried something he trusted beyond his own strength. Some kept tiny wooden crosses hidden inside sea chests. Others carried coins given by mothers before departure. A few believed certain knots brought good fortune. Others refused to whistle on deck, convinced it invited stronger winds. The sea encouraged belief in many forms. So many things remained beyond human control. The captain continued studying the darkness. Then he asked the sailing master a simple question. Our position. The sailing master hesitated. Not because he lacked knowledge, because absolute certainty no longer existed. During clear weather, navigators estimated their position through dead reckoning, compass headings, measured speed, and observations of the sun or stars. Tonight, neither sun nor stars had appeared for many hours. Clouds covered everything. Rain blurred visibility. Powerful currents might have pushed the ship farther than expected. The answer came quietly. Within 3 or 4 miles, perhaps. Perhaps. Among all the words spoken aboard a warship, few carried greater unease. Perhaps meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant danger. Charts in the early 19th century remained imperfect despite remarkable improvements. Many coastlines had been surveyed carefully, but isolated rocks sometimes escaped notice for decades. Storms occasionally altered sandbanks. Powerful tides shifted channels that once seemed dependable. An experienced navigator respected maps. He never trusted them completely. The order came. Hands to the braces. Immediately, dozens of sailors hurried toward the heavy lines controlling the yards. Every movement had to remain perfectly coordinated. One group pulling too quickly while another hesitated could leave sails backing against the wind rather than helping the turn. The bosun's whistle shrieked again. Heave. Thick rope stretched tight. Muscles strained. Boots slid across soaked planks. The massive yard slowly rotated. High overhead, the reduced canvas caught the wind from a slightly different angle. The bow began edging away. Slowly. Painfully slowly. No one watched the sailors working. Everyone watched the darkness ahead. Lightning flashed once more. The rocks appeared larger. Too large. Far too large. Another wave crashed against them, sending spray high into the air like pale smoke. Distance became impossible to judge accurately in darkness. They might still be half a mile away, or only a few hundred yards. The uncertainty gnawed at every mind aboard. Near the bow stood Mr. Fletcher, one of the oldest able seamen in the crew. His beard had turned almost completely gray after nearly 30 years crossing oceans. He never removed his eyes from the water ahead. Quietly he muttered, "She's answering." The younger sailor beside him frowned. "What?" "The ship." The older man nodded toward the bow. "You learn to feel it." The younger sailor looked puzzled. Fletcher smiled faintly despite the circumstances. Every ship has her own temperament. It sounded almost ridiculous. Yet among sailors, such language appeared perfectly ordinary. Ships became she. They were spoken to, praised, complained about, trusted, sometimes cursed. A crew spending years aboard the same vessel gradually believed they understood her personality. Some ships turned gracefully. Others fought every command. Some rode comfortably in heavy seas. Others rolled until every sailor became ill. Whether these differences belonged to engineering or imagination hardly mattered. The bond felt entirely real. Tonight, Fletcher believed the old warship still had enough life left to carry them safely clear. Everyone hoped he was right. The wind shifted slightly. Only a few degrees. Yet the sailing master noticed immediately. There. His finger pointed toward the main topsail. Now. Fresh commands echoed. The crew adjusted once again. The ship leaned farther as wind filled the altered canvas. Gradually, very gradually, the bow continued swinging. Another minute passed. Then another. Finally, lightning illuminated the rocks not directly ahead, but off the larboard bow. A collective breath escaped hundreds of lungs almost simultaneously. They were clearing them. Barely. The nearest breakers still appeared frighteningly close. Some sailors later swore they could hear surf booming against stone, even above the wind. Others insisted they smelled wet earth drifting from unseen cliffs. Whether either memory proved accurate became impossible to determine. Storms often reshaped recollection. Fear sharpened certain details while erasing others entirely. The danger, however, had been genuine. Within several minutes, the pale water surrounding the rocks faded into darkness astern. No cheering erupted. Nobody celebrated. The night remained dangerous. Storms rarely surrendered after a single challenge. Instead, the crew returned immediately to ordinary labor. That perhaps separated experienced sailors from landsmen more than anything else. Relief never lasted long. The sea always demanded the next task. Hours slipped by beneath low clouds. Rain diminished to a fine mist. Wind eased slightly. Not enough for comfort. Enough for breathing. One by one, the men most urgently needed on deck received permission to go below for a short rest while fresh hands replaced them. You descended the companionway carefully. The familiar warmth below decks felt almost surprising after hours in the freezing wind. Warm, however, did not mean pleasant. Wet clothing hanging from beams filled the compartment with a thick smell of damp wool and salt. The steam drifted from sailors attempting to dry jackets near the galley. Boots stood in uneven rows beneath benches. Water continued dripping steadily into buckets placed beneath persistent leaks. Nothing aboard ever became completely dry. You removed your heavy outer coat. The sleeves felt astonishingly heavy. Rainwater had nearly doubled its weight. When you wrung the fabric, a thin stream splashed across the deck. Nearby, another sailor laughed quietly. "We'll sink from wet jackets before enemy cannon." Someone answered. "Then the Admiralty will blame the carpenter." Even after exhausting labor, humor survived. Perhaps it had to. Without small moments of laughter, months at sea would have become almost unbearable. The cook had managed to relight part of the galley fire. Its warmth spread only a short distance, yet sailors naturally gathered nearby whenever duties allowed. A large copper kettle simmered gently above glowing coals. No elaborate meal waited inside. Only hot oat porridge. Plain, thick, almost tasteless. Yet on a freezing Atlantic night, it seemed magnificent. Each sailor received a modest portion in a wooden bowl. No one complained. Hot food mattered far more than interesting food. You cupped the bowl between chilled hands. The warmth slowly returned feeling to stiff fingers. Around you, conversation remained subdued. Nobody possessed enough energy for loud discussion. Instead, small groups exchanged quiet observations. One wondered whether tomorrow would bring calmer weather. Another speculated how many days remained before reaching Portsmouth. Someone mentioned his wife had promised to name their first child after him if he returned safely. An older Marine listened silently while polishing moisture from the lock of his musket with extraordinary care. Routine never stopped. Even after a storm, weapons required attention, clothing required mending, ropes required inspection. Life aboard a warship consisted less of dramatic events than of endless maintenance. Everything wore out. Everything needed repair. The sea showed no mercy toward neglected equipment. After finishing the porridge, you carried the empty bowl toward the galley. The ship moved differently now. Still rolling. Still pitching. But with longer, gentler motions. The violent jerks had become broad swells. That subtle change alone suggested the worst weather might finally be passing. Above, footsteps sounded less frantic. Commands came less frequently. Lanterns swung through smaller arcs. Exhaustion settled over the crew with remarkable speed. Adrenaline had carried everyone through the crisis. Now weariness reclaimed what it had temporarily surrendered. Eyes grew heavy. Movement slowed. Conversations dwindled into silence. The bosun eventually announced that off-watch men could return to their hammocks. Those words sounded sweeter than any music. One by one, the rolled canvas beds came down from the hammock nettings. Within minutes, the familiar forest of white hammocks reappeared between the great cannons. The gun deck transformed once again from a place of labor into a sleeping room. You tied your hammock carefully between its usual hooks. Experience had taught every sailor to check the knots before climbing inside. A poorly secured hammock could collapse in the middle of the night, providing endless amusement for nearby shipmates. Satisfied, you eased yourself into the canvas. Your muscles protested every movement. Shoulders ached from hauling lines. Hands burned despite thick calluses. Legs still remembered hours spent balancing against the rolling deck. Yet as the hammock accepted your weight and began its gentle, familiar sway, something unexpected happened. For the first time since the storm began, the ship felt peaceful again. Not silent. Never silent. The old oak continued speaking in quiet creaks and sighs. Water still murmured softly against the hull. Somewhere in the darkness, a sailor began snoring almost immediately, drawing tired smiles from the men nearest him. You closed your eyes. The motion that would make a landsman hopelessly seasick now felt almost comforting. Months aboard had changed your body, changed your habits, perhaps even changed your understanding of what comfort truly meant. A level bed no longer seemed natural. A complete silence felt strangely unsettling. The steady swing of a canvas hammock, surrounded by hundreds of sleeping shipmates inside the wooden heart of a Royal Navy warship, had become the closest thing to home that the Atlantic could offer. Sleep arrived slowly, not because the hammock was uncomfortable, but because the body refused to forget what it had just endured. Even with your eyes closed, you could still feel the heavy pull of wet rope in your hands. Your shoulders twitched occasionally as though another order might arrive at any moment. Several sailors experienced the same strange sensation after difficult nights. Long after work had ended, their muscles continued remembering. The human body adapted to sea life in curious ways. A landsman stepping aboard for the first time often believed the greatest challenge would be learning knots or climbing the rigging. Veteran sailors knew otherwise. The greatest challenge was teaching the body when it was finally safe to rest. The hammock rocked gently. Forward, back, forward, back. Each movement matched the slow breathing of the ship as she rose over long Atlantic swells. Somewhere nearby, rainwater dripped steadily into a wooden bucket. Another sailor murmured something unintelligible in his sleep. A rat darted across one of the overhead beams before disappearing into darkness. These sounds no longer disturbed anyone. They belonged to ordinary life. After several months aboard, silence would have seemed far more alarming. Deep within the hull, the pumps continued their endless rhythm. Although the storm had weakened, seawater still found countless tiny paths through the seams between oak planks. Every wooden vessel admitted water. Shipbuilders never pretended otherwise. Instead, they built ships expecting them to leak. That simple fact surprises many people today. The strongest warship in the Royal Navy still relied upon men working pumps every single day. Oak expanded when wet and reduced many gaps, yet no hull remained perfectly sealed. Saltwater seeped inside little by little, collecting in the bilge beneath the lowest deck. Left alone, that water would slowly rise. Too much water made the ship sluggish. More still became dangerous. Enough water could sink her. So every day, regardless of weather, sailors pumped. Not because something had gone wrong, because that was simply how life aboard a wooden ship worked. The pump handles creaked with patient regularity. Up, down, up, down. Somewhere in the darkness below your hammock, a team of tired men continued working while others slept. Before dawn, another crew would replace them. The work never truly ended. Hours later, a faint gray light began filtering through the open hatchways. Morning approached, not with brilliant sunshine, only with a dull silver glow hidden behind thick clouds. The bosun's whistle echoed once again. Not urgently this time, merely the beginning of another day. You opened your eyes feeling as though you had slept only minutes. Around you, hundreds of hammocks stirred almost simultaneously. Blankets folded. Boots searched for familiar feet. Men climbed carefully onto the deck, stretching stiff backs and aching shoulders. Nobody lingered. The gun deck belonged to the cannons during daylight. The sleeping quarters had to disappear. Within remarkably little time, every hammock had been rolled tightly and lashed into its proper bundle. Sailors carried them upward where they were packed neatly into the nettings running along each side of the ship. From a distance, those tightly packed hammocks resembled thick white walls. In battle, they served another purpose. Musket balls sometimes lodged harmlessly inside the tightly rolled canvas instead of striking the men standing behind it. No one designed them specifically as armor. Yet sailors appreciated every bit of extra protection available. As you climbed onto the upper deck, the world looked completely transformed. The storm had passed. The sea still rolled heavily, but yesterday's violence had softened into long blue-gray swells stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The clouds drifted apart in broken patches. Here and there, narrow shafts of sunlight reached the water, painting silver paths across the Atlantic. Fresh air washed away much of the stale smell trapped below decks. Nearly everyone paused, if only for a heartbeat, to breathe deeply. There were no mountains, no forests, no villages. Only water and sky meeting at a line so distant it seemed almost imaginary. For sailors who spent months crossing oceans, that horizon became strangely familiar. It was always present, always changing, always unreachable. Breakfast proved modest. Salt pork, ship's biscuit, a mug of weak beer. Fresh food had disappeared weeks earlier. At the beginning of long voyages, livestock sometimes traveled aboard. Chickens scratched around temporary pens. A few pigs occupied cramped spaces near the bow. Occasionally, even sheep made the crossing. One by one, they were slaughtered as the weeks passed. Fresh meat never lasted. Afterward came preserved provisions. Barrels became the true lifeblood of the ship. Barrels of salted beef. Barrels of pork. Barrels of peas. Oatmeal. Flour. Beer. Fresh water. Gunpowder. Pitch. Tar. Almost everything aboard lived inside barrels. Without them, ocean travel on this scale would have been impossible. Unfortunately, barrels brought problems of their own. Food spoiled. Water developed unpleasant tastes. Salt meat grew tougher with every passing week. Sometimes entire barrels had to be discarded because rot spread unnoticed. The purser kept careful records of every ration issued. Waste could shorten a voyage in frightening ways. After breakfast, ordinary duties resumed exactly as though last night's storm had never happened. One crew scrubbed the decks with sandstone blocks until the oak looked almost new. Another repaired damaged rigging. The sailmaker spread torn canvas across the deck, stitching long seams with heavy needles almost the size of a man's hand. Nearby, the cooper inspected barrels for leaking hoops. The ship's carpenter replaced several cracked pegs loosened during the storm. No one waited for things to break completely. Constant maintenance preserved both the vessel and everyone aboard her. The Royal Navy had learned that lesson through generations of expensive experience. An officer walking slowly along the deck inspected every corner with practiced eyes. He noticed loose rope immediately. An improperly secured bucket. A dirty musket. A rusting hinge. Nothing escaped attention for long. Discipline aboard a warship extended far beyond battles. It reached into every ordinary hour. Every polished brass fitting. Every neatly coiled line. Every folded sail. Order increased the chances of survival. Chaos invited disaster. Shortly before noon, the master-at-arms approached carrying a folded list. Several names appeared upon it. including one familiar sailor from your gun crew. His expression changed immediately. Not with fear, with resignation. Punishment aboard naval vessels rarely arrived unexpectedly. Most offenders knew perfectly well what awaited them. Yesterday afternoon, before the storm interrupted everything, he had been caught sleeping while assigned to watch duty. No captain tolerated such carelessness. The consequences endangered everyone aboard. The crew gradually gathered near the mainmast. Nobody looked eager. Watching punishment formed an unpleasant but unavoidable part of naval life. The bosun stood ready. So did the ship's surgeon. That detail often surprises modern readers. The surgeon attended not only battles and illness, but also disciplinary proceedings. His presence was practical. He examined punished sailors afterward, ensuring they remained fit enough to survive. The sentence today proved lighter than many had feared. 6 lashes. Painful, humiliating, but not fatal. The sailor accepted his punishment without resistance. He understood arguing would only worsen matters. The crew watched mostly in silence. No cheering. No applause. Many quietly looked away. Almost everyone understood that next month or next year, the unfortunate man might easily be someone else. Discipline remained harsh because life itself remained harsh. One sailor asleep at the wrong moment could overlook an approaching fire, a hidden reef, an enemy sail, a broken line. Hundreds of lives depended upon constant vigilance. Afterward, work resumed almost immediately. The punished sailor received treatment from the surgeon before being led below to recover. Conversation remained subdued for some time afterward. Such moments reminded everyone that the greatest dangers aboard a wooden warship did not always come from storms or enemy cannon. Sometimes they came from simple human exhaustion. As afternoon sunlight finally broke through the clouds, a cry suddenly echoed from high in the foretop. Sail ho! Every face lifted instinctively toward the lookout. The Atlantic had seemed empty only moments before. Now, somewhere beyond the glittering horizon, another vessel had appeared. At this distance, she looked no larger than a tiny white mark against the sea. Friend or foe? Merchantman or warship? British, French, Spanish, Dutch, or perhaps American? No one yet knew. The captain calmly accepted the lookout's report before raising his telescope. Around him, conversation ceased entirely. Life aboard a wooden warship could change with astonishing speed. 1 hour you scrubbed decks beneath peaceful sunshine. The next, every cannon aboard might be loaded for battle. The tiny white shape remained little more than a speck against the eastern horizon. At first, only the officers could see it clearly through their telescopes. Ordinary sailors shaded their eyes with roughened hands and searched the shimmering line where sea met sky, trying to distinguish ship from cloud. The Atlantic often played tricks upon the eyes. Distant waves sometimes resembled sails. Low clouds appeared like cliffs. Morning mist could imitate entire fleets before dissolving into nothing. The lookout continued watching from the foretop. Minutes passed. Then his voice floated downward once again. "Single ship, sir." That narrowed the possibilities only slightly. Merchant vessels usually sailed alone when danger seemed low. Warships sometimes became separated from their squadrons. Privateers often hunted independently. Pirates, though becoming far less common than a century earlier, still appeared in certain waters. No one aboard made assumptions. The captain lowered his telescope. "Maintain course." There would be no dramatic chase. Not yet. Distance remained too great. The crew returned to their duties, though concentration proved difficult. Every few minutes, another sailor found an excuse to glance toward the horizon. Curiosity spread quickly aboard ship. News traveled even faster. Within half an hour, nearly everyone knew another vessel had been sighted. No one knew what she was. That uncertainty filled conversations throughout the day. One Marine believed she must be a merchant brig returning from the West Indies. An older quartermaster disagreed. Too much canvas. A gunner's mate suggested perhaps she belonged to the Royal Navy. Someone else quietly mentioned the French. Nobody argued for long. The speculation accomplished little until the stranger drew closer. While attention drifted toward the horizon, ordinary life continued exactly as before. The carpenter supervised repairs to a damaged section of the larboard rail where heavy seas had loosened several fastenings during the previous night. Two apprentices carried fresh oak planks from the hold, while another sailor heated pitch inside a small iron pot. The smell spread quickly across the deck. Hot pitch possessed a sharp, smoky odor unlike anything found ashore. It clung stubbornly to clothing. Many sailors claimed they could recognize fellow seamen in crowded taverns simply by that unmistakable scent. Tar and pitch surrounded almost every aspect of naval life. Without them, wooden ships could not survive long. Rigging required protection. Deck seams required sealing. The hull demanded constant care against seawater. Everything depended upon preserving timber from rot. A neglected ship aged astonishingly fast. A well-maintained one might serve for decades. Several decks below, the sailmaker continued repairing canvas damaged by the storm. His workshop looked surprisingly peaceful compared with the busy upper deck. Great sheets of sailcloth covered the floor like pale blankets. Needles longer than a man's finger passed steadily through thick fabric while waxed thread tightened each stitch. Sailmaking demanded patience rather than strength. Every seam mattered. A poorly repaired sail might split apart during the next gale, leaving the ship struggling against weather with reduced speed and maneuverability. Nearby, another sailor sat quietly repairing shoes. Leather suffered terribly at sea. Saltwater stiffened it. Constant dampness encouraged cracking. Boot soles gradually wore smooth against rough oak planking. Most sailors became remarkably skilled at repairing their own clothing because replacement garments arrived only when the Navy supplied them, or when the next port offered opportunities to purchase new ones. Nothing useful went to waste. A torn shirt became patches. Old rope became smaller lines. Broke, and barrels became firewood. Worn canvas transformed into bags, covers, or cleaning cloths. Life at sea rewarded resourcefulness. The afternoon watch settled into its familiar rhythm. Above, gulls suddenly appeared. Only 3 of them. They circled briefly before disappearing toward the west. Several younger sailors smiled. Land can't be far. The old quartermaster overheard them and shook his head. Not always. He pointed toward the empty sky. Those birds can travel farther than you think. Experience frequently corrected hopeful assumptions. Still, birds lifted spirits. After weeks staring at uninterrupted ocean, any sign of living creatures beyond the ship itself reminded everyone that the world remained vast and varied beyond the horizon. Flying fish occasionally skipped across calmer waters. Porpoises sometimes raced alongside the bow. Whales appeared now and then, their immense backs rising silently before disappearing beneath dark water. Seabirds came and went with mysterious purpose. Every encounter broke the endless sameness of open ocean. The surgeon emerged onto the quarterdeck carrying his medical chest. His morning had been occupied tending yesterday's punished sailor along with several ordinary ailments that never disappeared aboard crowded vessels. One man suffered infected gums. Another complained of aching joints. Several carried small cuts beginning to fester after constant exposure to salt water. The surgeon inspected each patiently. Medicine during the early 19th century possessed severe limitations. He could clean wounds, set broken bones, amputate shattered limbs if necessary, mix herbal preparations, bleed patients according to accepted practice of the era. Beyond that, much depended upon luck, rest, and the remarkable resilience of the human body. Fortunately, the Navy had gradually learned several valuable lessons. Fresh air helped. Cleanliness reduced disease. Spoiled food killed. Though the exact reasons remained poorly understood, practical observation improved survival year after year. By late afternoon, the distant stranger appeared noticeably larger. Not close, but closer. Even without telescopes, sails could now be distinguished from clouds. The lookout continued describing what he observed. The 3 masts. Interesting. A small coastal vessel became unlikely. The captain studied her again through polished brass lenses. Still no flag. At this distance, colors blended into pale shapes. The officers gathered quietly around him. Their discussion remained too distant for ordinary sailors to hear. That silence encouraged fresh speculation. A powder monkey approached one of the older gun captains. "Do you think we'll fight?" The veteran smiled faintly. "Most ships you meet never fire a shot." The boy looked disappointed. The older man noticed. "You'll understand someday, that's usually good news." Experience altered a sailor's opinion of battle. Young recruits imagined glory. Veterans remembered noise. Smoke. Blood. Splintered oak. Friends who failed to answer morning roll call afterward. The gun captain had witnessed enough actions to know victory carried costs rarely mentioned in newspapers. As sunlight drifted lower across the western sky, the bosun ordered another round of routine inspections. Every cannon received attention. Iron surfaces were wiped clean. Carriages examined. Ropes checked carefully for wear. Many people imagined cannons sat unused until battle began. In reality, they demanded continual maintenance. Salt air encouraged rust with relentless determination. Wooden wheels shrank and expanded depending upon moisture. Iron fittings loosened. Every piece required constant care. The gun nearest your station weighed nearly 3 tons. Moving such a weapon required teamwork, even on calm water. During battle, dozens of trained motions had to occur almost automatically. Run out. Aim. Fire. Run in. Sponge. Load. Ram. Prime. Fire again. Crews practiced repeatedly because confusion could prove deadly. An accidental spark inside the gun deck might ignite loose powder. History remembered several ships destroyed not by enemy cannon, but by accidents aboard their own gun decks. The evening meal arrived just before sunset. Today the cook served boiled peas with salted beef. The beef required determined chewing despite hours simmering inside great copper kettles. Many sailors soaked pieces inside broth before attempting to eat them. Conversation remained livelier than usual. The unknown ship continued attracting attention. Every fresh rumor spread from mess to mess. One sailor insisted he had glimpsed British colors. Another swore the sails looked French. A Marine joked perhaps it carried nothing more dangerous than barrels of wine. Laughter followed. Even the possibility sounded pleasant after weeks of ordinary rations. As darkness approached once again, the stranger displayed a lantern, then another. Tiny golden points flickered across the distant sea. The captain watched thoughtfully. Night would interrupt identification until morning. No sensible commander approached an unknown vessel carelessly after sunset unless circumstances demanded it. The sea at night concealed too many dangers. Courses might intersect unexpectedly. Signals could be misunderstood. Hostile intentions remained invisible until dangerously close. Orders soon followed. Maintain present heading. Extra lookouts were assigned. Lanterns were carefully trimmed. The crew settled into another evening routine. No storm threatened tonight. The stars gradually emerged between scattered clouds. For the first time in several days, the heavens became clearly visible. The navigator climbed quietly onto the quarterdeck carrying his sextant. At last he could measure the stars properly. The observations would help confirm the ship's true position after the uncertainty created by yesterday's weather. Few sailors interrupted him. Navigation demanded concentration. The instrument gleamed softly beneath starlight as he aligned horizon and celestial bodies with practiced precision. Somewhere below, hammocks were once again being slung between the great guns. Another night at sea awaited. Yet unlike the previous evening, anticipation rather than exhaustion filled many minds. Out there in the darkness sailed another vessel whose identity remained unknown. By sunrise, the distance between the two ships would have narrowed considerably. And with daylight would come the answer every sailor aboard had been quietly wondering about since noon. Who was waiting beyond the horizon? The sea greeted the new morning with unusual gentleness. Long rolling swells lifted the warship almost lazily beneath a pale orange sunrise. Thin clouds stretched across the eastern sky, their edges glowing softly as the first light spread over the Atlantic. After the violence of the previous night, the calm seemed almost unreal. Many sailors woke before the bosun's whistle, simply because the ship moved differently. A wooden warship possessed countless moods. In heavy weather she groaned loudly, every beam protesting under enormous strain. During calm seas, she seemed to breathe more quietly, allowing smaller sounds to emerge from every corner of the vessel. A loose pulley tapped gently against the mast. The rudder creaked with slow, deliberate movements. Water whispered along the hull instead of crashing against it. The difference was enough to make experienced sailors smile without realizing it. As hammocks disappeared into the nettings once more, everyone knew the first task of the day. Find the stranger. The lookout reached the foretop before most of the crew had finished breakfast. He raised his telescope toward the eastern horizon and remained perfectly still for nearly a minute. Then came the report. "Ship in sight, sir." The captain accepted the telescope handed to him by his servant and climbed a few steps onto the quarterdeck for a clearer view. The vessel had indeed drawn much nearer during the night. She no longer appeared as a tiny white mark against the horizon. Now her outline could be distinguished clearly. 3 masts, square-rigged, large enough to carry respectable armament. Still too distant to identify her nationality with certainty. Morning sunlight reflected brilliantly from her sails, making every detail difficult to judge. The captain lowered the telescope only briefly. "Keep watching." No further orders followed. Patience remained one of the most valuable qualities an officer could possess. Hundreds of sailors, however, found patience considerably more difficult. Every few minutes, another man invented a reason to walk toward the bow. Some pretended to inspect rigging. Others carried tools they did not immediately need. Nearly all of them stole another glance toward the horizon before returning to work. The officers noticed. They chose not to comment. Curiosity was hardly a crime. The gun deck resumed its ordinary routine. Several crews practiced running out their cannons without loading them. The exercise happened so frequently that movements became almost instinctive. Each crew member occupied a precise position. One handled the sponge. Another prepared the cartridge. Others controlled the heavy ropes that restrained the cannon after firing. Every motion possessed a purpose. Confusion during battle wasted precious seconds. Practice eliminated uncertainty. The great guns rolled smoothly across the deck before being secured once again. Even unloaded, each movement demanded careful coordination. One misplaced foot could be crushed beneath an iron-rimmed wheel. One careless hand might become trapped between carriage and bulwark. Danger existed even during peaceful drills. Nearby, the master gunner inspected flintlocks used to ignite the cannon. Moisture remained their greatest enemy. Despite yesterday's storm, every firing mechanism had to remain perfectly reliable. He examined each one individually, replacing worn flints where necessary. His work rarely attracted attention. Yet if battle ever came, everyone would depend upon his quiet diligence. Above deck, several sailors climbed into the rigging, carrying small buckets of tar. Fresh sunlight provided an ideal opportunity for maintenance. The standing rigging endured constant punishment from wind, rain, and salt. A protective coating slowed decay. From below, the men looked like tiny insects moving effortlessly among ropes that stretched impossibly high into the sky. Visitors often asked whether sailors ever became afraid of heights. Most answered honestly. The fear never disappeared completely. One simply learned to work despite it. The Atlantic breeze freshened slightly. The warship answered eagerly. Canvas filled. The bow cut cleanly through the water, leaving long ribbons of white foam trailing behind. Flying fish suddenly burst from the sea ahead. For several seconds, they glided astonishing distances before disappearing beneath another wave. The younger sailors always enjoyed watching them. Even veterans paused occasionally. The ocean still possessed the ability to surprise those who had crossed it countless times. Not long afterward, a pod of dolphins appeared off the starboard bow. They seemed to materialize from nowhere. Sleek gray bodies rose gracefully through the water before diving beneath the surface again. Soon half a dozen raced alongside the ship. They matched her speed effortlessly. One leaped completely clear of the sea. Another twisted slightly before vanishing beneath the waves. Smiles spread across weathered faces. Many sailors considered dolphins fortunate companions. Whether superstition or simple affection hardly mattered. Their appearance always lifted spirits. Even the captain allowed himself a brief smile before returning attention to the distant vessel. The surgeon joined him quietly. A healthy crew this morning. The captain nodded absent-mindedly. Good. Health aboard ship could change with astonishing speed. A single contagious illness might spread through hundreds of men living in such close quarters. Fresh air, clean decks, and disciplined routines reduced that danger, but never eliminated it. The surgeon himself remained constantly alert for the earliest signs of trouble. Swollen gums, persistent fever, unusual rashes, persistent coughing. Each symptom demanded attention before it grew worse. His medical chest contained carefully labeled bottles, folded bandages, scalpels, saws, forceps, herbs, tinctures, and instruments that reflected the medical understanding of the age. Some treatments helped. Others did little. A few probably harmed more than they healed. Yet compared with earlier generations, naval medicine had improved considerably. The Royal Navy had gradually learned that prevention often mattered more than treatment. Below decks, the cooper inspected water barrels. Fresh water represented one of the ship's most precious resources. Each sailor received carefully measured rations. Waste could become disastrous during long voyages. Water rarely remained pleasant after weeks inside wooden casks. It absorbed strange flavors from the timber. Sometimes algae developed despite every precaution. Occasionally, the barrels themselves leaked. The cooper tapped each hoop with a small wooden mallet, listening carefully. An experienced ear recognized subtle differences immediately. A dull sound suggested loose staves. A clear ring indicated tight construction. His quiet craft rarely appeared in paintings of naval glory. Yet without skilled coopers, entire fleets might perish from thirst. Near midday, the lookout suddenly shouted again. "Flag, sir." Every eye lifted toward the stranger. A faint rectangle fluttered high above her stern. Distance still blurred the colors. The captain raised his telescope once more. Long seconds passed. No one interrupted. Finally, he lowered it. "You cannot make it out." A collective sigh escaped nearby officers. The answer remained hidden. Sunlight reflecting from the water distorted everything. Heat shimmer danced across the horizon despite the cool breeze. Identification would require more time. The two ships continued closing the distance. Slowly, steadily. Neither appeared to alter course significantly. It almost resembled two travelers approaching each other along an empty country road. Except this road measured thousands of miles across open ocean. Lunch passed quietly. Salted meat once again. Ship's biscuit. A little dried peas. Routine never changed dramatically aboard long voyages. Predictability itself became comforting. After eating, you found a few moments free from immediate duty. Leaning against the bulwark, you watched sunlight sparkle across endless waves. It was difficult not to think about home during such peaceful hours. Storms demanded complete concentration. Calm weather allowed memories to return. You wondered what season it was in your village now. Whether fields had been harvested. Whether children still played beside the churchyard. Whether your younger brother had finally become tall enough to help your father properly. Months at sea separated sailors not only from family, but from ordinary time itself. Life ashore continued without them. Children grew. Friends married. Parents aged. Some died before letters could ever cross the ocean. Communication moved only as quickly as sailing ships. A message written today might require months before reaching its destination. Sometimes it never arrived at all. The afternoon sun climbed higher. The stranger grew steadily larger. Now individual sails could be counted without difficulty. Crew members became visible as tiny dark figures moving across her yards. She was no illusion. She was a real ship carrying real men whose lives probably resembled your own remarkably closely. They too had likely slept in damp hammocks, worked through storms, missed their families, chewed hard biscuit, listened to creaking timbers throughout endless nights. The sea treated nearly every sailor alike, regardless of nationality, regardless of language, regardless of uniform. Late in the afternoon, another signal came from the foretop. This time the lookout's voice carried unmistakable excitement. She's hoisting colors. Every conversation stopped instantly. Every telescope turned toward the horizon. Every sailor who could find a clear view stared across the glittering Atlantic, waiting for the flag to unfurl fully in the strengthening breeze. Within moments, the identity of the mysterious vessel would finally be revealed. The flag did not unfurl all at once. For several long moments, it wrapped itself stubbornly around the halyard, twisting in the morning breeze as though deliberately delaying its own identity. Every sailor watching from the deck seemed to lean forward at the same time. The captain kept his telescope perfectly steady. No one spoke. Even the ordinary sounds of the ship, the creaking yards, the fluttering canvas, the gentle rush of water beneath the bow, appeared quieter than usual. Then another gust caught the cloth. The flag snapped open. The captain watched for several seconds before lowering his telescope. A merchantman. The word spread across the deck almost instantly. A merchant ship. Not French. Not Spanish. One by one, the rumors settled. No battle today. The tension that had quietly followed the crew since yesterday afternoon disappeared as naturally as mist beneath the morning sun. Several sailors smiled. One Marine laughed softly. The youngest powder monkey looked almost disappointed. The old gun captain noticed immediately. You were hoping for excitement. The boy nodded. I've never seen a battle. The older man rested both hands upon the breech of his cannon before answering. That's because you've been fortunate. The boy looked puzzled. The gun captain glanced toward the open sea before speaking again. The men who wish hardest for battle are usually the ones who have never stood inside a gun deck while the firing begins. He said nothing more. He did not need to. The conversation ended there. The merchant vessel continued approaching until both ships lay close enough to distinguish details without telescopes. She appeared smaller than the warship by a considerable margin. Perhaps 400 tons. Her hull sat lower in the water beneath the weight of cargo. Her paint had faded beneath years of salt and sunlight. Several patched sails suggested recent heavy weather. Even from a distance, she looked tired. A weather-beaten vessel carrying equally weather-beaten men. As the two ships drew nearer, each crew paused occasionally to study the other. The sailors aboard the merchantman looked remarkably similar to those serving in the Navy. Sun-darkened faces, rough beards, tar-stained jackets, scarred hands. Life at sea left similar marks regardless of occupation. A few men aboard the merchant vessel waved their hats. Several sailors aboard the warship answered with cheerful gestures of their own. Friendly encounters between ships never grew old. Weeks of isolation made even distant strangers feel strangely familiar. Signal flags climbed the merchantman's mast. Colored squares fluttered brightly against the blue sky. The captain called for the signal book. Within moments, one of the lieutenants began translating the message. Bound for London. A pause. From Madeira. Several officers nodded. Wine. Fruit. Perhaps sugar. Madeira ships carried many different cargoes depending upon the season. The warship answered with signals of her own. Names. Courses. Brief formal greetings. The entire exchange required only a few minutes. Long conversations through signal flags proved impractical upon open water. Soon enough, both vessels resumed their separate journeys. No dramatic farewell followed. The merchantman gradually slipped astern, her sails shrinking little by little against the horizon. By sunset, she would become another white mark disappearing into the vast Atlantic. Perhaps neither crew would ever see the other again. Such meetings occurred thousands of times each year. Brief, ordinary, soon forgotten. Yet they reminded sailors of something important. They were not entirely alone upon the world's oceans. As afternoon settled peacefully across the sea, the captain ordered several hours of additional sail drill. Some younger sailors groaned quietly. The veterans merely adjusted their jackets and prepared for work. Practice remained the foundation of every successful crew. The sea never announced when skill would suddenly become necessary. Men climbed rapidly into the rigging. Commands echoed upward. Braces tightened. Yards swung. Canvas shifted. Every movement happened with remarkable precision. Visitors often imagined naval discipline relied mainly upon punishment. In reality, repetition accomplished far more. A sailor who had climbed the foremast hundreds of times required little conscious thought when danger arrived. His hands simply knew where to grip. His feet found familiar places almost automatically. Memory became survival. While the crew practiced aloft, the chaplain walked quietly among the lower decks. Unlike officers, he rarely gave orders. Instead, he listened. A sailor showed him a letter nearly worn through its folds after months of repeated reading. Another quietly asked whether prayers would be held on Sunday if weather remained fair. The chaplain answered gently. Religion occupied a complicated place aboard warships. Some sailors attended every service faithfully. Others appeared only when required. Many prayed silently during storms regardless of their ordinary habits. The ocean encouraged humility in unexpected ways. Standing upon a wooden vessel surrounded by thousands of miles of water made human beings feel remarkably small. Late in the afternoon, the sailmaker received welcome news. Several repaired topsails had dried completely beneath the warm breeze. He supervised folding them carefully before returning them below. Every sail represented hundreds of hours of labor. Canvas cost money. Thread cost money. Replacement required time. Nothing aboard the ship existed casually. Everything possessed value because obtaining it again at sea proved nearly impossible. The cooper, meanwhile, completed repairs upon 2 leaking water casks. Satisfied with his work, he rolled them back into storage where they joined dozens of nearly identical barrels stacked carefully within the hold. Below them lay ballast. Great masses of stone and iron resting in the deepest part of the hull. Passengers rarely thought about ballast. Sailors thought about it often. Without sufficient weight below, a tall sailing ship became dangerously unstable. The heavy ballast kept the vessel upright, allowing enormous masts and sails to stand safely above. Even invisible things determined survival. Toward evening, a pleasant smell drifted unexpectedly from the galley. Someone sniffed the air. Then another. One sailor smiled broadly. A peas pudding. The cook had somehow managed to prepare a thicker, richer meal than usual using dried peas, onions preserved from earlier in the voyage, and scraps of salted meat. It hardly resembled a feast. Yet after weeks of ordinary rations, even small improvements became memorable. The mess gathered eagerly. Wooden bowls filled one after another. Steam rose gently into the cooling evening air. Conversation grew livelier. Stories returned. One Marine described serving in Gibraltar years earlier. Another sailor claimed to have crossed the equator 5 separate times. Someone else insisted he once saw a whale larger than the village church where he had been baptized. No one entirely believed him. That hardly mattered. Sea stories possessed a habit of growing slightly larger with every retelling. After supper, several fiddlers produced worn instruments carefully protected from moisture inside cloth coverings. Music aboard warships appeared whenever opportunity allowed. Not grand concerts, simple tunes. Familiar melodies remembered from villages scattered across Britain. One sailor tapped his foot. Another quietly hummed along. A pair of young Marines attempted a clumsy dance before laughter interrupted them. Even several officers smiled discreetly. Such evenings did not happen every day. Weather often prevented them. Duty frequently interrupted them. For a little while, however, the warship seemed less like a machine built for conflict and more like a floating community. As darkness gradually settled across the Atlantic, lanterns were lit one by one. The stars emerged overhead with astonishing clarity. Far from cities, the night sky appeared unimaginably rich. Thousands upon thousands of stars filled every corner of the heavens. The Milky Way stretched overhead like pale smoke. Many sailors learned the constellations almost as well as the navigator. Not from formal education, from necessity. The stars guided ships, measured time, offered reassurance during lonely watches. The navigator returned to the quarterdeck carrying his sextant once more. Tonight's clear sky promised excellent observations. Nearby, the sailing master compared compass headings with yesterday's estimates. Little by little, uncertainty vanished. Their position became clearer. Their course remained true. The captain seemed satisfied. Before retiring below for a few hours of rest, he paused beside the quarterdeck rail. The Atlantic shimmered softly beneath moonlight. Somewhere far astern, the merchantman had disappeared completely. Ahead lay nothing visible except open ocean. Weeks still remained before home. Weeks of ordinary watches, routine maintenance, simple meals, changing weather, countless nights inside gently swaying hammocks. For many people, such repetition might sound unbearably dull. Yet aboard a wooden warship, routine itself represented a quiet blessing. Because every sailor understood a simple truth learned through hard experience. The most dangerous days at sea almost always began looking exactly like ordinary ones. The following morning arrived wrapped in a thin veil of mist. Not the dense white fog that swallowed ships completely, but a soft gray haze that blurred the horizon and muffled distant sounds. The sea itself seemed quieter. Waves no longer sparkled beneath bright sunlight. Instead, they rolled beneath a pale sky that merged almost seamlessly with the water. From the quarterdeck, the captain studied the conditions without concern. Mist slowed observation. It did not stop the voyage. The lookout climbed into the foretop carrying his telescope as always, though everyone understood that today his eyes would see far less than usual. Visibility governed nearly every decision aboard a sailing ship. When the horizon disappeared, caution naturally increased. The helmsman kept the compass directly before him. Without distant landmarks or visible stars, that small instrument became the ship's most dependable guide. Its needle quivered gently before settling once again toward north. For centuries, sailors had trusted that tiny movement. Not because it was magical, because experience had repeatedly proven its value. Breakfast passed quietly. The cook distributed the familiar combination of ship's biscuit and salted meat. Several sailors dipped the biscuit into hot broth to soften it before eating. Others broke it carefully with the butt of a knife. One young recruit struck his biscuit against the edge of the mess table. Nothing happened. He struck it again. Still nothing. An older sailor watching nearby chuckled. "Try the deck." The recruit looked doubtful. The older man smiled. "I wasn't joking." The recruit tapped the biscuit against the oak planking. A corner finally broke away. Several nearby sailors laughed. "That's breakfast." Humor like this appeared almost every day. No one truly hated the biscuit. They simply accepted it as another unavoidable companion of life at sea. Fresh bread belonged to memories. This belonged to reality. Once the meal ended, cleaning began. The cleanliness aboard a wooden warship demanded constant attention. Hundreds of men occupied a relatively small space. Mud, salt, spilled food, tar, smoke, animal waste from the livestock carried during earlier weeks of the voyage, and ordinary dirt accumulated astonishingly quickly. Every morning, sailors scrubbed the decks. Buckets of seawater were hauled aboard. Sandstone blocks scraped away stubborn stains. Stiff brushes worked between the planks. The task was exhausting but essential. A clean deck reduced disease, prevented slippery footing, and preserved the timber itself. Visitors often imagined sailors spent most of their time climbing rigging or firing cannons. In truth, much of naval life resembled endless housekeeping, only on a far larger scale. The smell of wet oak gradually replaced the lingering odor of yesterday's meal. The sunlight attempted to break through the mist, producing a soft silver glow rather than direct light. The carpenter walked slowly across the deck, carrying a small wooden mallet. Every few steps he stopped and struck the planking lightly. Yap, yap, yap. Each sound told him something. Solid timber answered differently from damaged timber. Years of practice had trained his ears to recognize problems invisible to everyone else. One apprentice asked quietly how he knew where to listen. The carpenter smiled. "The ship tells you." The apprentice looked confused. "You only have to learn her language." He continued tapping. Few professions aboard demanded greater patience. A carpenter rarely became famous. If he performed his work well, nobody noticed. If he failed, everyone eventually did. Below deck, the gunner supervised another inspection of the powder magazine. No lanterns entered that sacred space. Only specially protected lights behind thick glass illuminated the room where hundreds of barrels of gunpowder rested. The rules surrounding the magazine were uncompromising. Shoes with exposed iron nails remained outside. Open flames were forbidden. Careless movement was unacceptable. One stray spark could destroy the entire ship. The powder itself represented extraordinary power compressed into black grains. Enough to hurl heavy iron shot across astonishing distances. Enough also to send 700 men to the bottom of the Atlantic in a single terrible instant if treated carelessly. The gunner checked every barrel. Dry. Secure. Properly stacked. Satisfied, he locked the heavy door once again. The key remained under strict control. Elsewhere, ordinary sailors repaired clothing. Needles moved steadily through worn sleeves. Buttons were replaced. Loose seams tightened. The Royal Navy issued clothing, but sailors quickly learned to care for it themselves. A torn jacket during winter crossings could become more than an inconvenience. It could become a threat to health. The sea showed little sympathy toward neglected equipment. Near midday, the mist finally began lifting. The horizon returned gradually. First a few hundred yards, then half a mile. Soon the familiar circle of open ocean stretched once again around the ship. Nothing interrupted it. No sails, no whales, no seabirds, only water. Many people imagine the ocean constantly teemed with visible life. Long voyages taught a different lesson. Days sometimes passed without seeing another vessel. Entire weeks might slip by without encountering anything larger than a distant dolphin. The Atlantic possessed an overwhelming emptiness difficult to imagine from maps alone. That emptiness influenced the mind. Some sailors found peace in it. Others found loneliness. A few struggled with both at the same time. One Marine leaned against the rail watching the waves. He had served ashore before transferring to sea duty. A sailor beside him asked which life he preferred. The Marine considered the question carefully. On land, he finally answered, "You march until your feet ache." He glanced toward the endless water. "Out here, your mind marches." The sailor nodded slowly. No further explanation seemed necessary. Months surrounded by the same horizon encouraged long periods of quiet reflection. Memories returned unexpectedly. Old conversations replayed themselves. Future plans occupied idle moments. Many sailors thought often about home, but spoke of it rarely. Doing so too frequently sometimes deepened the homesickness everyone quietly carried. The afternoon brought stronger wind. Not enough to cause concern. Enough to improve the ship's speed. Additional sails were set. The topmen climbed confidently into the rigging, their movements now almost effortless beneath clear skies. Looking upward from the deck, it seemed impossible that men could balance so naturally upon narrow yards suspended high above the sea. One newcomer admitted he still became nervous every time he climbed. An older topman laughed. "So do I." The recruit looked surprised. "You've been doing this 20 years. "I..." The older sailor tightened a line before continuing. "The trek isn't losing the fear." He looked down briefly toward the deck far below. "It's climbing anyway." That simple answer remained with the recruit long after the conversation ended. Courage aboard a wooden warship rarely resembled the stories told in taverns. It was usually quieter, more ordinary. A man climbing despite shaking hands. A surgeon beginning another difficult operation. A helmsman holed in course through darkness. A powder monkey carrying cartridges toward roaring cannons. Small acts repeated by ordinary people. Late in the day, the captain received the navigator's latest calculations. The figures confirmed encouraging news. Yesterday's observations had been accurate. The storm had pushed them slightly north of their intended track, but far less than originally feared. The correction required only a modest alteration of course. The helmsman adjusted the wheel. The great ship answered slowly, then continued steadily westward. The change appeared almost invisible. Yet over hundreds of miles, a few degrees mattered enormously. Navigation rewarded patience more than haste. As evening approached, the sea turned remarkably smooth. Sunlight reflected across the water like polished copper. Even the oldest sailors paused occasionally to admire the view. No matter how many voyages they completed, the ocean never looked exactly the same twice. One sunset painted the sky crimson. Another filled it with gold. Sometimes purple clouds drifted above silver water. Sometimes storms created colors impossible to describe adequately. Nature remained the greatest artist any sailor would ever know. After supper, several crew members gathered quietly near the bow. No music tonight. No dancing. Only conversation. Someone mentioned hearing porpoises during the middle watch the previous evening. Another remembered seeing strange blue lights glowing in the water years earlier. The older sailors nodded knowingly. Phosphorescence. Countless tiny living creatures disturbed by the ship's passage. At night, they transformed the sea into flowing ribbons of pale green fire. To newcomers, it appeared almost supernatural. To veterans, it remained one of the ocean's quietest wonders. Darkness settled gently over the Atlantic once more. Lanterns glowed softly beneath the quarterdeck. The first stars emerged overhead. The watch changed. Fresh sailors relieved tired companions. The endless cycle continued exactly as it had for generations. No one aboard realized that before another sunrise, the sea itself would present a sight so enormous, so unexpected, that even the oldest men among the crew would stop their work and stare in silent disbelief. The middle watch had only just begun when the ocean started behaving strangely. At first, almost no one noticed. The ship continued on her steady course beneath a sky crowded with stars. A cool breeze filled the topsails, and the familiar sounds of night drifted through the rigging. Somewhere below, men slept in gently swaying hammocks while others stood quietly at their stations, each wrapped in his own thoughts. The Atlantic appeared calm. Perhaps too calm. One of the quartermasters, resting his elbows against the rail, frowned slightly. He had crossed this ocean more than 20 times. Experience had taught him that the sea possessed patterns. Tonight, one of those patterns seemed different. He could not immediately explain why. The waves still rolled beneath the hull. The wind still pressed steadily against the canvas. Yet something had changed. He listened. There it was. The usual cries of seabirds had disappeared. During many nights, gulls or shearwaters occasionally circled passing ships, attracted by scraps thrown overboard during the day. Tonight, the sky remained completely silent. He mentioned it quietly to another sailor. The younger man shrugged. "They've gone elsewhere." "Perhaps." The older sailor continued watching the darkness. A few minutes later, another change became apparent. The dolphins. Only yesterday they had raced alongside the bow for nearly an hour. Now there were none. Not one splash disturbed the water beside the hull. Again, perhaps it meant nothing. The ocean seldom explained itself. Far below the surface, however, life was already moving. Thousands of small fish had abruptly changed direction. Larger fish followed. The chain continued upward through the vast underwater world in ways no sailor aboard could possibly see. Nature often noticed approaching giants long before human beings did. The lookout high in the foretop shifted his weight carefully upon the small platform. His telescope remained useless in darkness, so he relied entirely upon his eyes. Moonlight reflected softly across the Atlantic. Every so often a wave caught the light and gleamed silver before vanishing again. Then he saw it. Not clearly. Only movement. Far ahead. Large. Very large. He blinked. Nothing. Perhaps a trick of moonlight. He kept watching. Several long minutes passed. Then the water ahead seemed to rise. Not as a wave. Something beneath it. The lookout narrowed his eyes. The shape disappeared again. He hesitated, calling out unnecessarily embarrassed experienced sailors. Remaining silent could prove equally foolish. Finally he spoke. Movement ahead. The officer of the watch looked upward. What kind? The answer came honestly. I cannot tell, sir. No alarm sounded. The captain was not awakened. The officer simply walked toward the bow and stared into the darkness himself. For nearly 5 minutes nothing happened. Then one sailor quietly pointed. There. Everyone nearby followed his finger. A long black shadow moved across the surface. Slowly. Gracefully. Almost silently. It appeared larger than any boat. Larger than most ships' boats combined. The shadow slipped beneath the water once more. Someone whispered, "Whale." Another sailor nodded. Must be. Whales were not uncommon in the Atlantic. Yet seeing one always interrupted routine. Especially at night. The officer remained calm. Maintain course. The enormous animal posed no immediate danger. At least not intentionally. Another minute passed. Then came the sound. A deep rushing roar unlike anything else at sea. Not wind. Not surf. Not cannon. The sound resembled a giant pair of bellows emptying all at once. Every head turned instinctively. A towering white column erupted from the darkness scarcely 200 yards off the larboard bow. Water shot high into the moonlight before drifting away as glittering mist. Several younger sailors jumped visibly. The older men smiled. There she blows. The words carried quiet admiration rather than excitement. The great whale surfaced again. This time everyone saw her clearly. She seemed impossibly large. Her dark back rose slowly from the Atlantic until moonlight spread across smooth, wet skin. Then came another tremendous breath. The spray sparkled like silver dust before falling back toward the sea. She remained visible only moments. Without hurry. Without fear. Then she slipped beneath the surface almost soundlessly. Only widening circles marked where she had been. The entire ship appeared to pause. Even men below decks climbed briefly toward the hatchways after hearing voices above. Few opportunities existed to witness creatures of such size. The ocean suddenly felt much older, much larger. The quartermaster quietly estimated her length. Perhaps 60 feet. Another sailor disagreed. More. Sea stories often enlarged every animal. Yet even cautious estimates left everyone impressed. No living thing aboard the warship approached such dimensions. The carpenter leaned thoughtfully upon the rail. Imagine building a barrel from ribs that size. The cooper laughed softly. We'd need a forest. More shadows appeared. Not one whale. Several. The crew watched in fascinated silence. A small pod moved steadily across the ship's path, surfacing one after another with slow, measured breaths. Each exhalation echoed across the calm water. Whoosh. Silence. Whoosh. Silence. Their rhythm possessed an almost peaceful quality. No panic. No struggle. Simply ancient creatures following ancient routes across the Atlantic. One elderly sailor removed his cap respectfully. His father had hunted whales from small boats many years earlier. He remembered stories told beside winter fires. Stories of enormous tails striking the sea. Of boats pulled for miles. Of men disappearing beneath black water. Looking at the animals now, he understood those stories a little better. From the deck of a great warship, they seemed magnificent. From the side of a tiny whaling boat, they must have appeared terrifying. The pod ignored the vessel completely. The whales neither approached nor fled. They continued their journey with quiet confidence, as though wooden ships represented little more than drifting pieces of seaweed. Perhaps in their world they did. The surgeon joined several officers near the bow. He had spent years reading natural histories whenever opportunities arose in port. Quietly, he explained that whales breathed air just as humans did. Several younger sailors listened with genuine curiosity. Many people ashore still believed strange legends about sea monsters and giant fish. Practical observation slowly replaced such tales. Nature they disco. Verd proved remarkable enough without exaggeration. For nearly half an hour, the crew watched the pod. Then, one by one, the great animals disappeared into deeper water. The final blow sounded faintly in the distance. Soon nothing remained except moonlight upon gentle waves. The conversation continued long afterward. One sailor insisted he had seen an eye larger than a dinner plate. Another claimed the nearest whale had exceeded 80 feet. The oldest quartermaster smiled patiently. Every whale grows another 10 feet before reaching the next port. Laughter spread quietly through the watch. The sea stories had begun already. By breakfast, the animals would become larger still. Eventually, someone would swear one had been nearly as long as the ship herself. That was simply the way stories traveled. As the excitement faded, ordinary duties returned. The helmsman checked the compass. The lookout resumed scanning the horizon. The officer recorded the sighting briefly in the logbook. Date. Approximate position. Several whales observed crossing course during middle watch. Nothing more. History often survives in remarkably ordinary handwriting. The sailors below gradually settled back into sleep. Hammocks resumed their gentle motion. Lanterns burned lower. Above, the stars wheeled silently across the heavens. Hours later, the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon with pale blue light. The sea looked almost unchanged. Yet those who had witnessed the whales carried the memory with them. For months afterward, they would describe that quiet night when giants had crossed the Atlantic beside His Majesty's warship without the slightest concern for the tiny humans watching from the deck. It reminded every man aboard of something easily forgotten during long voyages. No matter how powerful a 74-gun ship might appear, she remained only a small visitor passing through an ocean that belonged to countless other lives long before sailors learned to cross it, and would continue long after the last wooden warship had vanished from the sea. Dawn spread slowly across the Atlantic. The stars faded one by one until only the brightest remained visible. The sea changed color with every passing minute, shifting from black to deep blue, then from blue to silver as sunlight crept over the horizon. Most of the crew knew nothing about the whales. They had slept through the encounter entirely. Only those assigned to the middle watch carried the story into the new day. Naturally, they began telling it almost immediately. By breakfast, the pod had already grown larger. By noon, according to certain enthusiastic accounts, one whale had supposedly surfaced close enough to spray the forecastle with seawater. By evening, some version of the tale would undoubtedly involve a creature nearly equal in size to the warship herself. No one objected. These stories were expected to expand. The truth remained impressive enough. A peaceful mood settled over the vessel. The ocean remained calm. The wind held steady. No mysterious ships appeared upon the horizon. No storms threatened from distant clouds. For once, the Atlantic seemed content to leave everyone alone. That rare gift allowed the crew to focus upon dozens of small tasks usually postponed during rough weather. The sailmaker organized repairs. The carpenter inspected storage compartments below deck. Several sailors polished brass fittings until they gleamed beneath the morning sun. Others carefully cleaned muskets and pistols. Salt air attacked metal constantly. Neglect could ruin valuable equipment surprisingly quickly. Near the bow, a group of younger sailors worked under the supervision of an experienced bosun's mate. Today they practiced knot work. To an outsider, the lesson might have appeared absurdly simple. A rope, a pair of hands, a few loops and turns. Yet entire ships depended upon knots. A poorly tied knot could cost a sail. A sail might cost speed. Loss of speed could cost a battle. Or a life. The bosun's mate moved among them patiently. This one holds under strain. He demonstrated carefully. This one slips free quickly. Another knot followed. Then another. Most sailors learned dozens during their careers. Some learned hundreds. Each possessed a purpose. The sea valued practical knowledge. Around mid-morning, the captain ordered the ship's log to be streamed. This was among the most routine and important tasks aboard any sailing vessel. A small wooden device attached to a line was cast over the stern. As the ship moved forward, the line paid out steadily. Knots tied at measured intervals allowed sailors to calculate speed. The procedure had been repeated countless times across countless oceans. The result was recorded carefully. 7 knots. A respectable pace. Not fast. Not slow. Enough to carry the warship steadily toward her destination. The navigator entered the figure into his records. Every day produced another small piece of information. Position. Speed. Direction. Weather. Taken individually, they seemed insignificant. Together, they guided ships across entire oceans. A little before noon, a cry rose unexpectedly from the starboard side. Not alarm. Excitement. Several sailors rushed toward the rail. You followed their gaze. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then sunlight caught something floating in the water. A barrel. The object drifted alone upon the Atlantic. Hundreds of miles from any visible land. Hundreds of miles from any visible ship. Just a solitary barrel rising and falling with the swells. The sight attracted immediate curiosity. Objects found at sea always did. The ocean possessed a strange habit of preserving mysteries. A broken spar. A shattered boat. A floating crate. Each hinted at stories no one could fully know. The captain observed the barrel briefly through a telescope. No effort was made to recover it. Stopping a large warship for every drifting object would consume endless time. Still, speculation began immediately. It fell from a merchantman. The storm washed it overboard. Maybe from a wreck. That final possibility encouraged silence. Everyone understood what wrecks meant. Not cargo. People. Somewhere, perhaps weeks earlier, another ship might have encountered whether she could not survive. The Atlantic held countless such stories. Most left no witnesses. The barrel drifted astern and disappeared gradually into distance. Yet it lingered in conversation long afterward. One sailor wondered where it had originated. Another wondered where it would eventually end. Perhaps it would wash ashore in Ireland. Perhaps Newfoundland. Perhaps nowhere at all. The sea rarely provided answers. At noon, the ship's bell marked the changing watch. The sun stood high overhead. The navigator emerged carrying his sextant. Unlike nighttime observations, this measurement depended upon the sun itself. Several younger sailors watched with fascination. The instrument appeared almost magical. Mirrors, brass, glass, tiny adjustments. Yet its purpose remained straightforward: determine where they were upon the face of the earth. For centuries, sailors had crossed oceans with astonishing courage and remarkably incomplete information. Navigation continued improving with every generation. The officers aboard this warship belonged to one of the most advanced maritime eras in history. Even so, uncertainty remained a constant companion. After completing his calculations, the navigator disappeared below deck. Numbers awaited. Distances. Charts. Corrections. Tiny errors multiplied quickly at sea. Accuracy demanded patience. The afternoon passed peacefully. Some sailors mended clothing. Others read letters preserved carefully inside waterproof pouches. One Marine spent nearly an hour carving a small wooden bird from a scrap of oak. The detail impressed everyone who examined it. "Who taught you that?" "My father." The Marine smiled faintly. "He built furniture." For a moment, his thoughts clearly traveled elsewhere. Perhaps to a workshop. Perhaps to childhood. Perhaps to a home he had not seen in years. Life aboard ship often consisted of such moments. Tiny reminders of lives that existed before the sea claimed so much time. Later, a group of sailors gathered beneath partial shade cast by the mainsail. The conversation drifted toward food. It frequently did. One described fresh bread from a bakery in Portsmouth. Another insisted no meal ever surpassed roast lamb prepared by his mother. A third swore that nothing compared to apples picked directly from an orchard. The debate continued cheerfully for nearly half an hour. Food carried powerful memories, especially when one spent months eating nearly identical rations. As the afternoon lengthened, the weather remained remarkably stable. The surgeon used the opportunity to inspect several men recovering from minor injuries. One sailor had strained his shoulder during the storm. Another carried a healing cut across his hand. A third suffered persistent tooth pain. Dental problems plagued sailors constantly. Modern dentistry did not exist. When pain became unbearable, extraction often remained the only solution. The surgeon examined the man carefully. The sailor looked nervous. Very nervous. The surgeon simply nodded. "Tomorrow." The sailor looked even less pleased. Nearby companions immediately began offering unhelpful advice. Some exaggerated the pain dramatically. Others claimed it barely hurt at all. None of them were convincing. Laughter followed. The unfortunate patient smiled despite himself. Toward evening, clouds began gathering far to the west. Nothing threatening. Only long gray streaks painted across the horizon. The sailing master noticed them immediately. Experienced sailors always watched the sky. Weather often announced it itself long before arriving. For now, however, the signs remained harmless. The captain appeared unconcerned. The sea continued rolling gently beneath the hull. The crew continued their duties. The day drifted steadily toward sunset. As darkness approached, several sailors climbed into the rigging to secure minor adjustments before nightfall. The sky glowed orange and gold behind them. For a few minutes, their silhouettes appeared suspended between ocean and heaven. Then the sun touched the horizon. A hush settled naturally across portions of the deck. Not because anyone ordered silence, because sunsets at sea possessed a certain power. Even the busiest sailor occasionally paused to watch. The enormous Atlantic reflected molten gold in every direction. The mast stretched long shadows across the water. For a brief time, the world seemed almost impossibly beautiful. Then the sun vanished. Lanterns were lit. The watches changed. Another night began. No one yet realized that somewhere ahead, beyond the darkness and beyond the visible horizon, another vessel was struggling through the ocean with a problem so serious that before many hours passed, her fate would become tied unexpectedly to that of the warship and every soul aboard her. The night remained remarkably peaceful. A gentle breeze carried the warship steadily westward while the stars wheeled silently overhead. Most of the crew slept soundly below decks, their hammocks swinging with the familiar rhythm that had long since replaced the comfort of beds ashore. Shortly after the middle watch began, the lookout suddenly stiffened. At first, he thought it was another star near the horizon. Then the light changed. It flickered, vanished, returned again. Not the steady glow of a lantern. Not the pale light of a planet. This was something else. He immediately called down. Light ahead. The officer of the watch raised his telescope, though darkness limited what he could see. The mysterious glow appeared again. This time brighter. Then darkness. Then light once more. The pattern repeated several times. The captain was awakened without delay. He reached the quarterdeck, still fastening the buttons of his coat, and accepted the telescope in silence. For several long moments, he watched the distant light. Then he nodded slowly. A signal of distress. The words spread quietly through the ship. No shouting followed. No panic. Only swift, practiced movement. Extra lookouts climbed into the rigging. The helmsman adjusted course a few degrees. Additional canvas was set where the wind allowed. Every sailor understood the unwritten law of the sea. When another ship called for help, you answered if you possibly could. The Atlantic was vast. Today another crew needed assistance. Tomorrow it might be your own. As the distance slowly closed, the light became easier to distinguish. Now everyone could see it. A lantern swinging desperately from the rigging. Another answered from lower down. Between the flashes, a dark outline gradually emerged against the horizon. A merchant brig. She sat strangely in the water. Her stern rode lower than it should. The captain studied her carefully. No guns run out. No sign of battle. The sailing master nodded. likely storm damage. When dawn finally arrived, the truth became clear. The merchant vessel bore the scars of the gale that the warship herself had survived days earlier. Her foretopmast had snapped away. Several sails hung in ribbons. One side of the hull showed obvious damage where heavy seas had smashed boats against the planking. Most alarming of all, exhausted men could be seen working desperately at the pumps. Even from several hundred yards away, their movements revealed the situation. The ship was leaking badly. The warship shortened sail and came alongside as closely as safety permitted. Voices finally crossed the water. Their captain explained that the storm had carried away much of their rigging. A falling spar had smashed through part of the upper hull. For 2 days, the crew had fought continuously to keep the incoming water under control. They had little fresh water remaining. Several men had been injured. One had died during the storm. Without assistance, they doubted the brig would survive another heavy blow. The Royal Navy captain listened carefully. Then he gave his answer without hesitation. "You shall have what we can spare." Boats were lowered. The carpenters crossed carrying tools and fresh timber. The surgeon brought bandages and medicines. Barrels of drinking water were transferred carefully. Additional rope, canvas, pitch, even fresh food from the warship's own stores. The injured merchant sailors watched with visible relief as unfamiliar faces immediately set to work beside them. No speeches were made. No celebration followed. Just ordinary men helping other ordinary men survive. For the rest of the day, both CR Yeos labored together. Royal Navy carpenters strengthened damaged sections of the brig's hull. The sailmakers stitched emergency canvas into usable sails. The surgeon treated broken bones, infected wounds, and deep cuts received during the storm. By late afternoon, the merchant captain reported encouraging news. The pumps were finally gaining on the incoming water. For the first time in days, hope returned. Before sunset, the two captains met briefly one last time. They exchanged names, courses, good wishes. No one knew whether they would ever meet again. The Atlantic had a way of scattering people across the world. The merchant brig slowly resumed her voyage toward England. The warship altered course and continued her own mission. Gradually, the distance between them widened. Soon the repaired vessel became another white sail upon the horizon. Then only a tiny speck. Finally, nothing at all. Life aboard the warship quickly settled back into its familiar rhythm. Morning watches, scrubbed decks, salted beef, creaking timbers, endless horizons. The voyage would continue for many more weeks before home finally appeared. Some sailors would finish their service and return to families waiting anxiously beside English harbors. Others would sign aboard another ship almost immediately. A few would spend nearly their entire lives crossing oceans until the sea itself became more familiar than any town or village. Years later, many of those men would remember storms, whales, strange sunsets, endless nights inside gently swaying hammocks, and the exhausting labor that filled every ordinary day. Yet among all those memories, one lesson remained stronger than the rest. Life aboard a wooden warship was rarely comfortable. The food was plain. The work was relentless. Privacy scarcely existed. Storms could arrive without warning. Disease remained a constant threat. Battles, when they came, transformed familiar decks into places of smoke, splintered oak, and unimaginable courage. And yet, within that harsh world, remarkable friendships formed. Skill was respected. Duty mattered. Small kindnesses carried enormous weight. A shared bowl of hot porridge after a freezing watch. A shipmate quietly taking another man's turn at the pumps. A surgeon refusing to sleep until every wounded sailor had been treated. A captain choosing compassion as readily as discipline. History often remembers the great admirals, the famous victories, and the mighty ships that changed nations. But the true story of a wooden warship belonged just as much to the ordinary sailors whose names rarely appeared in any history book. They climbed impossible rigging before sunrise. They trusted fragile wooden hulls across unforgiving oceans. They slept in canvas hammocks beneath rows of silent cannons. They endured hardships that seem almost unimaginable today, not because they believed themselves extraordinary, but because each new day simply demanded another watch, another rope to haul, another sail to mend, another mile of open sea to cross. And perhaps that is what sleeping aboard a wooden warship was really like. Not one endless nightmare, not one grand adventure, but thousands of ordinary moments of exhaustion, resilience, fear, laughter, routine, and quiet courage woven together until they became a life. The Atlantic has long since fallen silent around those great wooden ships. Their sails are gone. Their gun decks are empty. Their hammocks no longer sway beneath oak beams polished by generations of sailors. Yet if you stand beside the sea on a calm evening and listen carefully as the tide rises against an old harbor wall, it is not difficult to imagine that somewhere beyond the horizon, the timbers of an old ship still creak gently, her lanterns still glow warmly through the darkness, and another tired sailor is climbing into his canvas hammock, grateful simply to have survived one more day upon the endless ocean. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.